COVID-19 changed the world in 2020. A highly contagious, rapidly spreading virus forced people to isolate themselves from loved ones and stay indoors. In the early part of the pandemic, there were still a lot of questions about how the virus spread, how serious it was, and most importantly, how long would we all need to isolate from one another? 2 weeks quickly turned into 2 months to 3 to 4. There was no end in sight. Workplaces switched to remote operation, leaving only those deemed essential to return to the workplace. And humans, the social animals that we are, turned to things like drive-by celebrations and video chat to stay in touch. Apps like Zoom, House Party, and other video conferencing apps soared to popularity. There was a strong desire to keep that face-to-face contact, and we adapted these practices rather quickly in order to keep sane in our new norm. But it wasn't just work and socialization that needed to make a drastic change. One of the things hit hardest by the pandemic was the school system. Welcome back. In part one of this documentary, we took a look at the start of distance learning and how it grew through the 2021 school year. In part two, we're going to dive a little bit deeper. We're going to talk about equity among students. We're going to see who was hit hardest by distance learning, and we're going to contemplate how we can strengthen distance learning moving forward.
I definitely think some students learn better online for a variety of reasons. I think it also gives flexibility to students when they have remote learning. And really, remote learning and distance learning was a thing before the pandemic. The pandemic is what threw it into public light. So if it was something that was being formulated and worked on before that, there has to be some merit to it.
So we're really looking to see the results of 3 years of distance learning this June in terms of standardized testing, which is concerning. In terms of grades, we made some policy changes. I will pat myself on the back for being the person who first suggested, and then it was ultimately implemented, to not allow any failing grades to be issued for the entirety of distance learning. If a student was failing, the lowest grade they could get was an incomplete. And those students were given, if it was first marking grade, they're given the remainder of the year to turn that incomplete into passing grade.
We were very big on center-based learning, letting them explore and do things on their own and make their own choices. But as far as technology, we weren't really able to let them make their own choices. It was basically, we would come on and we would teach a lesson or post a video in the beginning until we started really doing Google Meets. And then it was, okay, now it's your independent work time. Here's the worksheet you have to complete, or here's the assignment you have to complete. It wasn't really, that's where I struggle with distance learning for kindergarten. Can it be done? Most likely, it can most definitely probably be done. But for the little ones, I struggle with their socialization aspect.
But I think that even way before the pandemic, right? People that study online learning, distance education, we already knew this, that it's a different set of skills and a different type of student that excels in that online environment. Suddenly everyone in the world is doing this, and only a few people kind of were working towards it. I think that people learned a lot very quickly, educators learned a lot very quickly, parents learned a lot very quickly, students did too, and they are in a better place for it.
Another major problem that school districts had to tackle with the shift to distance learning was equity amongst their students. Now, this is not a new conversation by any means, but once the initial shift to distance learning happened, it became a major concern. New York State is very diverse. According to the Department of Education, 41% of all students in New York State are white, 28% are Hispanic or Latino, 16% are Black or African American, 10% are Asian or Pacific Islanders, 3% are considered multiracial, and 1% is American Indian. When you're looking at statistics, it's important to ask yourself who's being accounted for here. If you take a look at the statistics for New York State, 4% of all students are homeless, 10% are English language learners, 18% are students with disabilities, and a whopping 57% of all students in New York State are considered economically disadvantaged.
My district is very big on equity. My principal and my parent coordinator, they would go to the school, even, though we were shut down, and they would have parents come in and they made sure every child had a device, whether it was an iPad or a laptop. Everyone had a device, and everyone, if they didn't have internet, like I said, my one little Ashley, I'll never forget, because I would call her dad every day, and he's like, I don't have internet. So then I was in touch with my parent coordinator, and my parent coordinator would get in touch with Spectrum, because I believe it was Spectrum, or it was probably a bunch of them that was giving internet access, and then they got them connected. So after like a couple of weeks in the beginning where she wasn't logging on, finally she was able to log on.
So because we had such little technology in my school to begin with, the equity issue when it came to like the technology and stuff was not really handled by the school. In the beginning of the pandemic, all the requests for devices and internet all went in through the DOE. Then I think the DOE kind of realized like, oh, we can't really like handle what we promised, so like let's shift it to the school a little bit. So the school and I think the DOE did work very hard to create that like equity to begin with, but I don't necessarily think it was handled in the best way. Throughout New York City, there were places where kids could, and families, and then they opened it up to any New York City resident, were able to go and get food. There were meals offered. They were able to, in the very beginning, they were able to pick up breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We had a lot of families in my school that took advantage of that. So I do see the importance of having those. So maybe there needs to be a shift back towards community-based organizations and outside organizations that are helping families that need those meals or need the washer and dryer to do their laundry or need access to clothes or, like a safe space or doctors or the dentist.
Emergency situation like that, the top priority was getting devices in students' hands. But if we could have done it again, there were 100 ways we could have improved that process. I would probably have strongly pushed for centralization of the process, a single location for all families and students to go, instead of having to distribute devices all across the district and then have a family show up and be turned away for their youngest child because that child actually goes to a different building and they have to go there. So things got a little bit hectic there, and that's where you start breaking your own systems and procedures because family starts to complain and say, I'm not going all the way across town to get this, so you guys just give me two. And so somebody breaks down and gives them two, and then the whole system's thrown off because we gave two devices to a family who only should have gotten one at that location. And it goes on from there. There were still a lot of equity issues in ways that you might not necessarily initially think. It's not the biggest issue in a district like New Rochelle. We have plenty of funding. It's never an issue of concern of can we afford enough Chromebooks for everybody to have one. It's communication is actually probably the biggest individual equity problem where you have 3,200 students. You probably have, I did the numbers earlier this year, but 200, 300 parents who have no email address on file with us at all. An additional 200 or 300 whose emails bounce back, and then probably another couple hundred who maybe it's an old email. It technically works, but they're not checking it regularly. So getting communications to them in an expedient way is tough. And then of course you run into language barriers. Yeah, you can send things out in English and Spanish, but that is not by any means all the languages spoken in New Rochelle. We have one of the most diverse districts in the country.
Even with all the challenges of distance learning and the added challenges of equity, I was curious how student performance did during this time of distance learning. Due to a lack in data of standardized testing in the 2020 school year, it was hard for me to look at the data and assess the learning of certain students. So I decided to look at another statistic, graduation rate in New York State. Now, between 2019 and 2020, the graduation rate rose 2%, and it rose another 1% in 2021. Now, this goes against the national trend. A lot of states saw dipping graduation rates, but New York differed. So I wondered why.
There are a lot of things that I'm thinking about. One is 2% a normal fluctuation in that graduation rate anyway? Like, is it a coincidence, or is it a statistically significant difference in the number of kids that are graduating? Like, if we look at graduation rates over 15 years and also the trend that more students are graduating anyway, so I don't know how much stake I would put in that number as being something that really carries a lot of weight. But let's say it did, that a small but significant number of students are graduating more. I think not having those standardized tests, for sure, because someone was going to fail them and not be able to graduate. Like, that's just true, right? That, so if they didn't have the tests, then whatever percent of students were not going to be able to graduate because they failed the test, graduated. So then, we just need to talk about if the tests are worth it, if they measure what they say they do, what other assessment means should be in place.
I think that students were relieved of the pressure of standardized testing. Not everyone needs to graduate with a Regents diploma. That's not the track that everyone needs to take. I think that our education system fails a lot of kids in both aspects, whether it being a little bit easier for kids to graduate now or before that. I also know, as a public school teacher, I know that kids' grades get changed. I know that exceptions are made. I know when you go to summer school, you're not necessarily held to the same standard that you would be if it was like an in-school class. So I think that there have been exceptions made for kids to graduate all the time. So I do not attribute the increase in graduation to the lax standards of remote learning.
After looking at the data, I realized that Matt was right. There was an upward trend of graduation rate in New York State for many years. So I needed to check my feelings a little bit. Did I want distance learning to be the reason that the graduation rate bumped up 3% since the start of COVID-19? I decided I couldn't fall into yet another trap of statistics, though. I needed to see who was actually being counted. And when I started breaking down the demographics of New York State, I did notice some surprising trends at the start of the distance learning model. When I started looking at the individual demographics of New York State, what I found was that economically disadvantaged students' graduation rate rose 4% between 2019 and 2021. Students with disabilities also rose 4% between 2019 and 2021. But the demographic that actually rose the most during this time of distance learning was English language learners. English language learners' graduation rate rose 8% between 2019 and 2021. Another important demographic to consider is students of color. On average, the graduation rate of students of color rose at a greater rate than the average for New York State, effectively narrowing the achievement gap. These numbers are astounding, and I wholeheartedly believe that distance and hybrid learning played a pivotal role in increasing these demographics' graduation rate.
There were some surprises, particularly most notably in self-contained, we call them core classes, but self-contained 15-to-1 classroom special education settings. Going through the data, it looks like the reason there was a big benefit to a lot of those students, not all, we can never speak for all students, but a lot of our 15-to-1 self-contained students their main day-to-day issues in a school building are behavioral and social. So with those issues not eliminated, but greatly reduced, and the level of distraction of having, a kid tapping their pen and then another student gets upset about it or gets into an argument or something. With those things all but eliminated, a lot of students actually did much better. And this is what paved the way for the discussion of how do we make this an optional long-term solution for certain students who benefit from that environment, that is an online environment.
And well, I mean, this is like one of the things that's going to come out and is coming out, like online learning and being able to run an online class has huge benefits for some kids. So if you're sick with COVID at home, it doesn't mean you missed 2 weeks of school. It just means you did it from home. And there are all kinds of students that have chronic illness, that have other things that keep them out of school, and they don't have to miss school as much anymore. We're learning ways around that on a large scale, which is one of the good things that's coming out of it.
Could this rise in graduation rate of these demographics be a coincidence? Maybe, but I do have to think that distance learning does play a pivotal role in the increase in their graduation rate. Now, it's important when you're looking at these demographics that even though it is broken down a little bit, some of these terms are still very broad. For instance, students with disabilities could mean anybody from a student who has trouble with mobility to a student with a certain developmental disorder, both of which would benefit from distance learning models in various ways, whether it be through accessibility or even just allowing for more time to actually work on the problems at hand. Now, the demographic that had the biggest rise in graduation rate was English language learners. So I wanted to get a little bit perspective on that. In a recent episode of the podcast, The Conversation, Professor Hung had 2 international students on, Grace and Jan. Grace and Jan both have an interesting perspective because they are involved in distance learning, both in a class that was built online as well as a class that was forced to change to a distance learning model because of the pandemic.
I have the experience that because I can have more time to think about what the teachers talk and what is the discussion topic, and I have time to give my opinion. So I think, this is a good way that technology can help us to learn the another language. And also, I think technology has a lot of ways to help people to learn the second language, because there is some tools that can help us to improve our, for example, English, because English is not my mother language. And sometimes if I need to read some articles written by English, I find some words I don't know the word's meaning. And in the traditional way, I should find a dictionary, but it rarely takes time. So technology can help us, can help me to find the word's meaning quickly and efficiently. And I can find the words, how to use the words, not only the meaning, but also the usage. So I think this is kind of the ways that technology can help us to learn another language.
Clearly, distance learning has a wealth of benefits for many different students, and some students might benefit more from a distance learning model. So I wanted to know, what is the future of distance learning? Could it be improved upon? And could it even be implemented as a permanent option in New York State?
I don't think this environment is good for every learner. I think for some it is, and I think it should be an option.
I actually was very disappointed going back to work this year when there was no remote learning option offered to New York City public school kids. I think that it was a missed opportunity. I think that our education system in the United States, New York State, whatever you want to talk about, is very outdated, and it's no longer like meeting the needs of our learners. So I was really disappointed and actually very angry that was not an option offered this year.
That they're moving back in the classroom, yes, for sure. That they're moving away from distance learning, I don't think it's that whole idea of like we can't go back anymore. We're just talking in the mobile learning course that I'm teaching about reading on paper and reading on screens. And we're talking about the cognition of it, right? Like whether it's better to have like a physical print or whether you can comprehend as well reading on screen. But one of the points I made was it doesn't matter anyway. No one's going to read anything on paper 5 years from now in a class anyway. I think in that way also, especially at the secondary level, like high school at the very least, no one took down their Google Classroom. That's how the students get their assignments. That's how they turn in their work. And, maybe 10% of teachers were doing it before, and now 80 to 90% are using it as their way of instruction. So we have kind of a post-pandemic world of instruction where a lot of the technologies have remained. And I don't know that we know exactly what that looks like, but it's definitely the case that they're not going to drop some of this stuff. Here's my main tip. Once you decide like the small set of tools you want to use, try to work with them, try to understand what they do well, and then work within the features and affordances that they offer and set up your class and your instruction that way. Because if you try to go the other way, like I must do this activity and I have to make it fit in this system, then it's just a lot more frustration, a lot more difficult, and you're wasting your energy. So you need to rethink things to kind of make the most of the tools you have, because you're relying on them more than ever, than in a much more flexible kind of live classroom.
We are currently looking at a virtual academy. It's an opt-in school setting for students who would like to participate and who would benefit from being in a fully online environment moving forward, regardless of a pandemic. I have, on my own, hypothesized that is the future, and I anticipate fully that there will be, totally official and, accredited high schools that will be able to provide these services online and function as a full online high school. Whether they're public or private, that's a different question. That is my actual only real hope in it, is that we're just providing another avenue for students to engage academically in an environment that's conducive to their learning. In a world of differentiation and tons of special education services, it's just one more avenue we can offer for students who would benefit from it.
I wholeheartedly believe, as a student of educational technology and as an expert in the field of telecommunications, that distance learning is the future. It may not be for everybody, but I don't want to forget the lessons we learned from the pandemic, and I want to strengthen distance learning models and see them perfected and implemented as a permanent option in the future. I'd love to hear from you if you're an educator, a student, or a parent, and if you have any sort of opinion on how you can improve distance learning for the future, please email me at the address below, and thank you for watching.